When I heard my uncle telling grandfather Kenneth shouldn't come for visits anymore, while I was standing behind the door, I knew something was wrong. At that moment, I realized this wasn't just family tension. For 3 months, I thought grandfather had forgotten about me, but actually my uncle was deliberately isolating him. And what the lawyer told us on Monday would destroy my uncle's life forever. When I heard my uncle telling grandfather Kenneth shouldn't come for visits anymore, while I was standing behind the door, I knew something was wrong. At that moment, I realized this wasn't just family tension. For 3 months, I thought grandfather had forgotten about me, but actually my uncle was deliberately isolating him. And what the lawyer told us on Monday would destroy my uncle's life forever. My name is Kenneth Morrison, 34 years old, and until that autumn evening, I believed my family was built on trust and love. I worked as a software engineer in Manchester, living a quiet life in a small flat near the city centre. Every Sunday for the past 8 years, I would drive the 40-minute journey to visit my grandfather, Edgar Morrison, in his cottage in the Cotswolds. Grandfather Edgar was 87 years old, a retired railway engineer who had spent his entire life building something meaningful. His small cottage sat on 12 acres of beautiful countryside, worth nearly £600,000 according to recent valuations. But more than the property value, that place held our family's entire history. Every stone, every tree, every room contained memories of 3 generations of Morrisons. The cottage had been in our family since 1948, when grandfather bought it with his savings after returning from the war. He had worked double shifts at the railway depot for 15 years to pay off the mortgage, never taking a holiday, never buying anything unnecessary. My grandmother, Margaret, had planted the rose garden that still bloomed every spring. After she passed away 12 years ago, grandfather maintained every flower bed exactly as she had left it. My uncle, Thomas Morrison, was grandfather's eldest son and had always been the golden child. At 52, Thomas owned a small accounting firm in London and visited grandfather maybe once a month, if that. He was married to Patricia, a sharp-tongued woman who made no secret of her disdain for our family's modest means. They had 2 children, Oliver and Charlotte, who rarely bothered to visit their great-grandfather. Thomas had always been the successful one in the family. While I chose a stable career in technology, Thomas drove expensive cars, lived in a large house in Hampstead, and frequently bragged about his business dealings at family gatherings. He spoke to grandfather with barely concealed impatience, often checking his phone during conversations and making comments about how the cottage was too much work for an old man. The change began subtly in early summer. Grandfather, who had always been sharp and witty, started seeming confused during our visits. He would ask me the same questions repeatedly, forget conversations we had just finished, and sometimes look at me as if trying to remember who I was. I attributed it to normal aging, perhaps early stages of dementia. Then the visits became more restricted. Thomas would call me on Saturday evenings, saying grandfather was having a bad week and perhaps I should skip Sunday's visit. At first, this happened once a month, then twice, then nearly every week. When I insisted on visiting anyway, I would find grandfather withdrawn, tired, and sometimes barely acknowledging my presence. The grandfather I knew would have been delighted to see me, eager to share stories about his week, interested in my work and life. Instead, I found a confused old man who seemed almost afraid to speak. I should have questioned this dramatic change, but Thomas convinced me it was natural progression of age-related decline. 3 months ago, the visits stopped entirely. Thomas told me grandfather had specifically requested no visitors except immediate family, which apparently meant only Thomas and Patricia. I was heartbroken, but respected what I believed were grandfather's wishes. I sent letters that went unanswered and left voicemails that were never returned. Last Thursday evening changed everything. I had driven to the cottage that Thursday evening without calling ahead. The autumn rain was heavy, but something inside me insisted I needed to see grandfather. When I arrived, I noticed Thomas's black Mercedes in the driveway, unusual for a weekday evening. I approached the front door, but heard voices from the sitting room window. I recognized Thomas's voice immediately. What I heard made my blood run cold. "The old man is becoming too difficult," Thomas was saying to Patricia. "He keeps asking about Kenneth, wondering why his grandson doesn't visit anymore. I told him Kenneth has been busy with work, but he's getting suspicious." I crept closer to the window. Through the curtains, I could see Thomas pacing, while Patricia sat in grandfather's armchair, looking through legal documents. "Maybe we should just let Kenneth visit once or twice," Patricia suggested coldly. "Just to keep the old man calm until everything is finalized." "Absolutely not," Thomas snapped. "Kenneth has always been Edgar's favorite. If he starts visiting regularly again, the old man might change his mind about the will. We're too close now to risk it. The lawyer said everything should be ready by next week." My hands began to shake as the manipulation became clear. They weren't protecting grandfather from visitors because of his health. They were isolating him to control his decisions about the inheritance. "What if Kenneth shows up unexpectedly?" Patricia asked. "Then we deal with it," Thomas replied. "I've already told Edgar that Kenneth has been saying negative things about him, that he only visits because he expects money when Edgar dies. The old man was hurt, but he believed it. That's why he agreed to stop the visits." I felt sick. Thomas had been lying to both grandfather and me, creating a false narrative that turned us against each other. For 3 months, grandfather believed I thought poorly of him, while I believed he no longer wanted to see me. "The power of attorney documents are almost complete," Patricia continued. "Once Edgar signs these tomorrow, we'll have complete control over his finances and medical decisions. The cottage sale can proceed immediately." "Good," Thomas said. "I've already found a buyer, a property developer willing to pay $800,000 for the land. Edgar thinks we're just organizing his finances, but once he signs tomorrow, we can move him to that care facility in London and sell the cottage within the month." I backed away from the window slowly. My mind was reeling. Thomas wasn't just manipulating the inheritance. He was planning to sell the family cottage, move grandfather into institutional care, and steal everything our family had built over 3 generations. But they had made one crucial mistake. They assumed grandfather was completely under their control, that his mind was too far gone to understand what was happening. What they didn't realize was that Edgar Morrison had survived a world war, built a successful career, and raised a family through decades of challenges. His instincts were still sharp. I quietly returned to my car and drove home, but I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about grandfather sitting alone in that cottage, believing his favorite grandson had abandoned him, while Thomas and Patricia plotted to steal his life's work. I called in sick to work on Friday and drove back to the cottage, waiting until I saw Thomas's car leave. Then I walked up to the front door and knocked. When grandfather opened the door, his face showed surprise, confusion, and something that looked almost like fear. He seemed smaller than I remembered, more fragile, but his eyes were still the same intelligent blue. "Kenneth?" he said quietly, looking past me as if expecting to see someone else. Thomas said that you didn't want to. Grandfather, I interrupted gently. We need to talk. Grandfather invited me inside with trembling hands. The cottage felt different, colder than I remembered. We sat in his sitting room, where I had overheard Thomas and Patricia planning their deception. Thomas told me you said things, Grandfather began quietly, that you thought I was becoming a burden, that you only visited because you felt obligated. Grandfather, I said gently, I never said those things. I love you. Thomas has been lying to both of us. Grandfather looked up at me, his blue eyes searching my face. But why would Thomas lie? He's my son. Last night, I heard Thomas and Patricia talking outside this window. They've been isolating you from me deliberately. They want you to sign legal documents that will give them complete control over your money and this cottage. The colour drained from Grandfather's face. That's impossible. Thomas said those documents were just to help organise my affairs. They're planning to sell the cottage to a property developer for £800,000. They want to move you into a care facility in London and keep all the money. Grandfather was quiet for a long moment. When he looked up again, his eyes had changed. The confusion was still there, but underneath I could see the sharp intelligence that had always defined Edgar Morrison. I knew something was wrong, he said slowly. These past few months I felt like I was losing my mind. Thomas would tell me about conversations I couldn't remember having. There's nothing wrong with your mind, Grandfather. Thomas has been manipulating you, making you doubt yourself. Grandfather's jaw tightened with anger. My own son, he whispered. He stood up and walked to an old wooden desk in the corner. He pulled out a key and unlocked the bottom drawer, retrieving a manila folder thick with documents. Thomas has always been jealous of this cottage, Grandfather explained, returning to his chair. He never understood what this place meant to us. He opened the folder and pulled out several sheets of paper. After your grandmother died, Thomas started making comments about how I should sell the cottage. But you refused, I said. Of course I refused. This cottage holds 60 years of memories. Thomas sees only the monetary value, but to me, this place is priceless. Grandfather handed me one of the documents. It was a copy of his current will, dated 3 years earlier. I scanned the contents and saw that the cottage and majority of his assets were left to me, with smaller bequests to Thomas and his children. Thomas doesn't know about this will, Grandfather said. He assumes everything will go to him as the eldest son. 3 years ago, I tried to explain I was leaving the cottage to you because I knew you would preserve it. What did he say? I asked. Grandfather's face darkened. He accused me of favoritism. He said he deserved the inheritance because he was older and more successful. I understood now why Thomas had been so desperate to isolate Grandfather from me. If Grandfather signed the power of attorney documents, Thomas could potentially contest or change the will. They're planning to have you sign new documents tomorrow, I told him. Once you sign, they'll have legal control over all your decisions. Grandfather nodded grimly. Thomas called yesterday and said a lawyer would be coming tomorrow morning. We need to stop this, I said. But we need to be smart. Thomas can't know that we've talked. Grandfather leaned forward, and I saw the determined man who had built a successful career through difficult times. What do you suggest we do? First, we need evidence. I heard their conversation, but that won't be enough legally. There's something else, Grandfather said, reaching into the folder again. Thomas has been handling my bank statements for 6 months. But I've been suspicious about some expenses. He handed me bank statements. As I reviewed them, I noticed several large withdrawals and transfers that seemed unusual. £5,000 to Hampstead Home Care Services, I read aloud. £3,000 to Morrison Financial Consulting. Do you remember authorising these payments? I've never heard of either company, he replied firmly. My blood began to boil as I realised Thomas had been stealing from grandfather for months, creating fake companies and siphoning money. This wasn't just about the inheritance. It was systematic financial abuse. We're going to stop them, I told grandfather, my voice filled with determination. And we're going to make sure Thomas faces consequences. Grandfather smiled for the first time since I'd arrived. Tell me what you need me to do. Over the next 2 hours, grandfather and I developed our plan. His experience and my technical knowledge created the perfect combination. First, I explained, we need to record tomorrow's meeting with the lawyer. Do you have a smartphone or any recording device? Grandfather shook his head. Thomas insisted I didn't need one at my age. That's fine. I'll bring a small digital recorder and hide it in the room before they arrive. You need to act completely normal, as if our conversation today never happened. I understand, grandfather said. But what exactly should I say during the meeting? Ask questions, I replied. Lots of them. Make the lawyer explain exactly what each document means, what powers Thomas will have. The more they explain on tape, the stronger our evidence becomes. And the bank statements? The fake companies Thomas created. I'm going to research those companies tonight. If I can prove they don't actually provide services, we'll have evidence of fraud. I paused. But we need to be careful. Once you refuse to sign those documents tomorrow, Thomas will know something is wrong. What do you mean, refuse to sign? Grandfather asked. You can't sign them, grandfather. Once you do, Thomas will have legal authority over everything. We need to stall for time while we build our case. Grandfather looked worried. But how do I refuse without making Thomas suspicious? Tell them you want your own lawyer to review the documents first. Say you've been reading about elder fraud in the newspapers and you want to be cautious. And if Thomas objects, then we'll have that objection on tape, which will look very suspicious later. Grandfather smiled grimly. You know, Kenneth, I think you inherited your grandmother's strategic mind. We spent another hour going over the details. I would arrive early tomorrow morning and hide the recording device in grandfather's sitting room. Then I would wait in my car down the road until I saw Thomas and the lawyer leave. There's one more thing, grandfather said. Thomas has been pressuring me to give him access to my safe deposit box. He says it's for estate planning purposes, but now I understand he's probably looking for the original copy of my will. Where is the original will? I asked. Hidden here in the cottage, somewhere Thomas would never think to look. Grandfather stood up and walked to his bookshelf, running his finger along the spines until he found a worn copy of Great Expectations by Charles Dickens. He pulled it out, and I could see it had been hollowed out to create a hiding space. Your grandmother's idea, he explained, showing me the original will nestled inside the fake book. She said the best place to hide something valuable is in plain sight. Thomas has probably looked right at this book 100 times without realizing what it contains. Exactly. The original will is safe, and I've made sure my solicitor in town has a copy as well. As I prepared to leave, grandfather grabbed my arm gently. Kenneth, If this plan doesn't work, I want you to know that fighting back was worth it. These past few months, feeling powerless and confused, believing you had abandoned me, it was the worst time of my life. The plan will work, grandfather, I assured him. Thomas has been so focused on manipulating you that he's made himself vulnerable. Tomorrow, his own words will trap him. I drove home that night with excitement and nervousness. The emotional stakes were enormous. At home, I spent hours researching the fake companies that had been billing grandfather's account. Hampstead Home Care Services had no website, no business registration I could find. Morrison Financial Consulting was slightly more sophisticated, with a basic website, but when I dug deeper, I discovered the business registration showed Thomas Morrison as the sole proprietor. The evidence was overwhelming. Thomas had been systematically stealing from his own father for months, using fake companies to justify withdrawals. Combined with tomorrow's recorded meeting, we would have everything we needed to expose his entire scheme. I set my alarm for 6 in the morning and tried to get some sleep, but my mind kept racing through all the things that could go wrong. What if Thomas suspected something? What if grandfather couldn't maintain his act during the meeting? Finally, around 3 in the morning, I drifted off to sleep. My phone woke me at 6. Today was the day we would finally fight back. I arrived at the cottage at 7:30, parking my car out of sight behind a cluster of trees. Grandfather was waiting for me, already dressed in his best suit, looking more alert and determined than I had seen him in months. "Are you ready for this?" I asked, checking the small digital recorder I had brought. "More ready than I've been for anything in years," he replied firmly. "Let's catch Thomas in his own trap." I hid the digital recorder behind a porcelain figurine on grandfather's mantelpiece, positioning it perfectly to capture every word. "Remember," I whispered to grandfather, "act confused, ask lots of questions, and don't sign anything." Grandfather nodded, his eyes sharp with determination. "Don't worry, Kenneth. I've been dealing with manipulative people longer than Thomas has been alive." I left through the back door and positioned myself in my car behind the trees. At 9 o'clock, Thomas's black Mercedes pulled into the driveway, followed by a modest sedan. My phone was connected to a listening app. As they settled into the sitting room, I could hear Thomas's voice. "Father, this is Timothy Richardson. He's here to help us organize your legal affairs." "Hello, Timothy." Grandfather's voice came through, sounding confused and elderly. "I'm not entirely sure what this is about." Perfect. Grandfather was playing his role exactly as planned. "Timothy is going to help us set up paperwork that will make it easier for me to help you with your finances," Thomas said patronizingly. "Could you explain exactly what these papers do?" Grandfather asked. "These are power of attorney documents. They allow your son Thomas to make financial and medical decisions on your behalf." "But I can make my own decisions," Grandfather said. "I'm not incapacitated." "Father," Thomas said carefully, "you've been having difficulty managing your affairs." "I never forgot to pay the electric bill," Grandfather said firmly. "Well, these documents are just a precaution. Think of it as insurance." "What exactly would you be able to do with these powers?" "Thomas would be able to access your bank accounts, make investment decisions, buy or sell property on your behalf." "Including selling this house?" Grandfather asked. "Yes, if it were in your best interests," the lawyer replied. "And who decides what's in my best interests?" "Thomas would make those decisions." "That's a lot of power. What if I disagreed with the decision Thomas made?" Father, Thomas interjected, his voice becoming sharper, why would you disagree? I only want what's best for you. But hypothetically, what if I did disagree? Once the power of attorney is in effect, your son's decisions would be legally binding. You would need to go to court to challenge them. This is very concerning, Thomas. You said this was routine paperwork, but it sounds like I would be giving up control over my entire life. Father, you're overthinking this, Thomas said, frustration creeping in. I don't remember agreeing to anything like this, Grandfather said firmly. Your memory has been getting worse, Thomas said. That's why we need these documents. My memory is fine when it comes to important things, Grandfather replied. And this house is the most important thing in my life. Mr. Morrison, the lawyer said carefully, these documents need to be signed voluntarily. If you have concerns, perhaps you should consult with your own attorney. That's an excellent idea, Grandfather said. I'd like to have my own lawyer review these documents. Father, that's not necessary, Thomas said quickly. We don't need to involve anyone else. But I want to involve someone else, Grandfather said stubbornly. Thomas, why are you so opposed to me getting a second opinion? Grandfather asked. I could hear Thomas breathing heavily. He was losing control. Fine, Thomas said finally, his voice tight with anger. But every day you delay signing these documents, you're putting yourself at risk. What if something happens to you? I suppose I'll deal with that when it happens, Grandfather said calmly. Are you? Thomas snapped, his facade cracking. Because from where I'm sitting, you can barely remember to eat lunch, let alone manage a £600,000 property. Thomas, Grandfather said, shocked. It's true, Father. You're declining, and you're too proud to admit it. The lawyer cleared his throat uncomfortably. Perhaps we should table this discussion for today. After they left, I waited 10 minutes before returning. Grandfather was sitting in his chair, exhausted but triumphant. Did you get it all? He asked. I retrieved the recorder and played back Thomas's voice. Every day you delay signing these documents, you're putting yourself at risk. Perfect, I said. We have everything we need. Thomas completely lost his composure. What's our next step? Grandfather asked. Now we take this to the police. 3 days later, I sat in Detective Inspector Sarah Collins's office at the local police station, playing the recording while she took notes. The evidence of financial abuse was overwhelming, especially when combined with the fake company documents I had researched. 2 weeks after that, Thomas Morrison was arrested on charges of elder financial abuse, fraud, and attempted coercion. The fake companies he had created were shut down, and the stolen money was returned to Grandfather's accounts. The cottage remained in Grandfather's hands, exactly where it belonged. And every Sunday I continued my visits, just as I had for 8 years, sharing tea and stories in the sitting room where justice had finally been served. Thomas learned the hard way that underestimating the quiet ones is always a mistake. Some battles are won not with loud confrontations, but with patience, planning, and the simple power of truth.